Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in Line Go Up, The World and Mechanics of Victoria 3. I know that's kind of a ridiculously long title for an intro video for a playlist, but I wanted to frame the playlist for everyone, because I think that what we're going to be doing here is going to be useful to people. This is going to be simultaneously an over-explained tutorial where we're just going to help you learn how to play the game from the ground up, but it's also going to be a series of video essays where we talk about what it is that the game is trying to model from the real world and why it is trying to model it the way that it is. I think that understanding those two critical pieces of information is going to make you a better player at this game, but I also think it's just fun to talk about, so indulge me if you wish. There will be timestamps in each video to try to help direct the flow of traffic. Where we're talking about mechanics, I'll throw in timestamps. Where I'm just talking about whatever, I'll throw in another one. So skip my musings if you wish, but I think they will be useful. Before we jump in on the campaign itself, what is Victoria 3? Victoria 3 is a video game by Paradox Interactive that takes place between 1836 and 1936. Paradox Interactive does a lot of what they bill as grand strategy games these days, but in reality, to me at least, they're more than just a grand strategy game. They are a historical simulation game, and Paradox has been making those for a very long time. I've been playing Paradox games since EU2 MyMap, so probably since before some of you were born, boomer. Victoria 3 is one of their latest iterations of these historical simulation grand strategy games, and it's during a really critical time period when it comes to human development. So during this time period, we see the first and second industrial revolutions, we see World War I, we see the development of modern pharmaceuticals, we see the development of explosives, we see the development of rail, the consumption of fossil fuels, the dramatic increase in imperialism and the subsequent decrease in independent peoples in the world. We see the eradication of both slavery as well as indigenous people in the United States and throughout the world. It's a time period that's defined by inequality, with massive wealth disparities emerging between the global East and the global West, the exploitation of people throughout the world to create raw resources for specific nations that successfully industrialized. It's defined by dramatic increases in infrastructure. Two of the most important pieces of human infrastructure in the world are built during this time period, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. We see automation technologies, electricity, and this is a game that aims to model that in its entirety to the best of its ability. But it is itself a game, and understanding human history is very complicated and requires some shortcuts, because there are some things that are just like inherently unknowable. Do we know for sure that slavery was banned in the United States and in Brazil because of the actions of a couple of specific people, or because of the actions of a large number of people? Were those actions taken independently, or were they taken as a consequence of economic actions going on in the background? Because slavery really does collapse on a world stage during this time period, and some would argue, because there's this massive pattern of it, that it's less dependent on the microcosms of each individual nation and more influenced by the macrocosm of this long 19th century. And that's where historiography sort of steps in. So in history, it's kind of impossible to understand everything and to know everything. We're not Dr. Manhattan or whatever, so we have to construct narrative devices that help us understand the pieces that we're missing, and that's sort of what historiography is. But it's also kind of dangerous because people fall into the trap of thinking that the historiography is objectively correct or incorrect, and then they end up where they've spliced frog DNA into their dinosaurs and now they're eating the tourists or whatever. Don't think of historiography as necessarily testable, because it's not really meant to be thought of as a scientific thing. It's rather just meant to be a pedagogical thing more than anything else. Victoria 3, it leans on something called economic determinism. So economic determinism is a historiographical model that sort of describes human history as having occurred primarily due to the economic needs and desires of humans. So for instance, the Crusades wasn't just about religious wars, it was also about economic access. It argued that the exploration and colonization of the Americas was driven by the economic needs of the Iberian nations and not by the religious needs to convert people, and that most of the frame tales that we tell ourselves, at least most of the frame tales that humans told themselves earlier were really like self-propaganda, right? That Spain didn't go to the Americas to convert natives, they went there to get gold. But that is a lens, right? It's a lens that tells you why humans are doing things without the knowledge of really what the people involved were making decisions based off of. It's also, of course, overstated here and hyperbolic. Anyone who ascribes to economic determinism is going to tell you that, of course, the actions of mass political movements and the actions of, air quotes, great people do matter, but that economic determinism is the sort of background vehicle that creates the environment where those political movements and people exist. But the game itself really does try to capture the feel that your politics and your society derives itself from the economics of this time period. And I think that's flavorful because, frankly, I think there are some things that occur on a broad scale worldwide during this time period that only make sense if you assume that there are global patterns in place rather than just local patterns in place. Why did nations conquer Africa? Did they do it exclusively because they wanted to educate the natives? I don't think so. I think they did it because they wanted raw resources, because they wanted prestige. These things are inherently derived, except for the prestige factor, from the economic reality of the nation in question taking these actions. So, what are you playing as in Victoria 3? That's kind of like a central question that I think you need to resolve before you play it. It's flexible, fortunately. If you decide that you're playing as something else, then you can play as something else. It definitely offers you the opportunity to roleplay as much as you want. I would encourage you, at least initially, to roleplay not as a specific nation or as a specific person within that nation, but instead as the historical force of industrialization. That you should play trying to industrialize your nation, trying to make it a great power, trying to help it achieve #1 rank on great power, getting your GDP really, really high, line go up. Because I think that if you learn how to play that way, then you can take the pieces out of the puzzle and you can kind of design a campaign with a different goal in mind, and it'll let you get a lot more replayability out of it. I think trying to learn from a role-playing purely first is going to hold you back. If you can make yourself imagine that you are the god of death from Princess Mononoke after its head has been blown off, and that you're this magical force of industrialization just spreading your horrible tentacles over the world, I think you'll probably play the game, air quotes, better. It'll feel more natural. Just lean into that. You're a historical force. Line go up. Why is the AI important? The AI is important because, of course, in Victoria 3, it doesn't matter what nation you are inflicting your horrible industrial superpower upon. You're not gonna own the entire world at the beginning of the game. And what that means is that the actions and behaviors of the AI are going to inherently influence the way that you play, just as how you conceptualize what it is that you're playing as and how you address what it is your goals are for the campaign, just as important what the AI is doing. So in Victoria 3, the AI has some behaviors that are like relatively predictable, some things that are less predictable, and some things that are like kind of predictable, but in a way that's only frustrating. The AI has strategies. So these strategies are supposed to be derived from the IGs of people in government, perhaps the ruler, the nation's current level of industrialization and literacy and GDP and stuff, and its rank in the world. The strategies are going to create an economic strategy, a political strategy, and a diplomatic strategy, and those things are going to inform the behavior of the AI. If it has expand resource industries, then whenever it has access to government construction, it will go out of its way to try to expand resource industries if it looks like it makes sense for the nation. Conservative agenda, maybe it'll try to quash some specific liberal reforms. Contrasting to that, promote liberal reforms will try to promote liberal reforms within its politics. And then a diplomatic strategy, which will affirm usually how frequently a nation is going to intervene in diplomatic politics. Most great powers you will see will have something beyond defend our borders, and therefore are going to be much more interested in intervening in wars. Sometimes they'll have maintained balance of power. The biggest issue that I think most people are going going to encounter, though, is that on the highest difficulty level, harsh aggressive, the AI largely stops thinking as much about this strategy in regards to the player, and largely just does like total war, stop the player at all costs. Even if we've already fought 4 wars and have been paying war reparations for 25 years, they'll fight you a lot. They just will. So be aware of that. But you should also be aware that AI nations are not really all created equal. So of course in Victoria 3, everyone starts with like wildly different amounts of resources and wealth and power. That's just the nature of the world in 1836. But the game has also made some very deliberate design choices in regards to AI behavior. So for instance, construction, which is the basis through which a government can actually spend money on not just infrastructure, but also on capital infrastructure for the development of an industrial economy. Construction is derived from a couple of different things, including the relative size and GDP of the country, as well as its laws. And what this means is that certain nations will just like not industrialize in the game, and because they're not going to industrialize, they won't really increase their GDP that much, and because they're not increasing their GDP, they won't be able to create more construction, and then they won't be able to start resource extraction, and then they won't be able to participate in the market in a particularly productive way. And what that feedback loop means is that, generally speaking, the smaller and more backwards a country is, the more you should desire to just conquer them and remove them from the map, because they're not going to provide a lot of value to you. But the larger and more industrialized a nation is before you puppet them, the more resources that they have access to in terms of their construction, the more construction they'll feed into their private construction. The private construction, in contrast to the government constructions, are going to just focus in on whatever is going to generate the most productivity and most profitability, with the asterisk of whoever is paying into the investment pool kind of has control over where it goes and who gets money back. But this is really important for you to understand, that the AI is sort of the ocean in which your nation is swimming. You'll hopefully become a giant shark or a terrifying sea beast that swallows the world, but you do need to understand that depending on what nation you're playing as at game's start, you might need to dial in your expectations as to what you can accomplish. Small nations start pretty darn weak in Victoria 3. Katamari Damacy, that's my recommendation to you. But because the AI also doesn't do a great job of developing its resources and construction when it's small, that means that generally speaking, raw resources are going to be extremely scarce in Victoria 3. You need to go out of your way to ensure that you are conquering things that have raw resources associated with them. And that's a behavior that the game kind of produces for you, that models behaviors of nations during this time period, right? If you ascribe to economic determinism, then you say, okay, the great powers of Europe invaded and conquered Africa because they wanted the coal and the rubber, the logging and the iron and the diamonds and the gold, and not because they went there to civilize the natives or whatever the actual propaganda of the time was. People understood, at least on a meta perspective, that the reason they were engaging in imperialism was primarily to increase their prestige and their rank in the world, as well as to create money if they could, even if it wasn't money that was going to be equitably distributed or distributed at all. So in this playlist, we're going to be playing with Sardinia-Piedmont. We're going to be trying to do line go up. We're just going to be trying to make our nation as powerful as possible. There are going to be some second order consequences of that. If you're making your nation very powerful, you're making your pops very wealthy. If you're making your pops very wealthy, you'll create high standard of living, high literacy. You'll also probably create Italy just so you have access to more pops and more resources. You're probably going to imperialize, as well as more capital, because getting your rank up in the world is going to create even more growth for yourself because of the way prestige sort of feeds into itself. It is a snake eating its own tail. The higher your prestige goes, the harder it is for other nations to hold on to their rank. If their prestige drops too low and they drop out of a specific rank, then all of a sudden your diplomatic options are more open. just as in the real world during this time frame, there was this long 19th century with relatively few large land wars between the European great powers. That's an overstated thing, of course. Those of you who know European history know that there were plenty of wars in continental Europe during the 19th century, but it is partially true, right? We didn't have any grand scale Napoleonic total wars until World War I, which was almost 100 years later. Rather, largely the 19th century and its conflicts were defined by inequalities of power and wars between larger nations and smaller nations. That's why you see so few independent nations at the beginning of World War I. Most of them just got devoured by imperialism. All right, that's it for this episode of Line Goes Up. In our next episode, we are going to be beginning with Sardinia-Piedmont. We're going to play Sardinia-Piedmont, as I said, with sort of like an industrialization loop as our goal. We're going to be playing as the historical force of industrialization, but that's going to produce some different behaviors for us. It's also going to inform like what sort of metrics are important, what sort of things we need to think about, how we can make line go up, but we'll also talk about like how to use some of these capacities and like appropriate way to develop them if you're trying to make line go up, because I think that those things are interconnected, and I would like people to know, if your goal is to make your nation as wealthy and powerful as possible, behaviors to get there agnostic. So yeah, if that sounds fun, then stay tuned. That's coming to We Play Games. That's Walker. Take care.